Good morning, everybody. It's kind of wild to be here in person. This is the first time I've been in a group with more than one other person from outside of my bubble in 11 months. So this is a little wild on a lot of levels. So, but I'm excited to be here with you guys. Have you ever known that things weren't right, but had no idea how to make them better? Have you ever wanted things to change desperately, but felt confounded by how to get there? Have you ever felt trapped in a system that was eating you alive, stuck treading water just to keep afloat, but with no way through? Have you ever considered that the solution might just be to throw a party? Yeah, that's not my usual assumption either. But today we're going to continue our conversation about spiritual disciplines by thinking about the discipline of hospitality. And we're going to start by remembering the story of Zacchaeus in Luke chapter 19, verses 1 to 10. Now, I could read it, but I think it's going to be more fun if I tell it to you as a story. So first, let me set the stage. Jesus is going along from Galilee to Jerusalem. It's a long way by foot, 112 kilometers, which happens to be exactly as far as it is from my house to the CN Tower if you go around the 427. And Jesus and his disciples have come to Jericho, about 88 kilometers into that journey, or as far as Pearson Airport, if you're going that way around the city. All the way along, they've been meeting people and talking with them. Jesus has healed lepers, preached about the end times, told parables, answered questions, and taught the disciples. In case all of that news hadn't preceded Jesus' arrival to Jericho loudly enough for crowds to form, as he approached the city, he healed a blind man begging on the side of the road. So by the time Jesus gets to the gates, everybody seems to know that he's coming, and a big crowd has gathered. This is when Luke introduces us to Zacchaeus. Now, there are a few things we need to know about Zacchaeus. The one thing that most of us think we know about Zacchaeus is from a song we learned in Sunday school. Zacchaeus was a wee little man, and a wee little man was he. You remember the one. So if you're like me, you'd always pictured Zacchaeus as a short little dude. And if you knew that people in Jesus' time were generally shorter than we are today, you might have even thought of Zacchaeus as a bit of a dwarf. But I went and did some digging recently, and it turns out that calling someone short in stature in this time period was only possibly about his real actual height, and more about making the fact that he was the bad guy. See, there's this ancient idea in literature called physiognomy. And even back in the day, people used to use descriptions of people's face, their hair, their shape, or their stature to help underscore the nature of the character that they were trying to describe. In other words, it was a little bit like when the bad guy shows up in an action movie and they have that particular shade of black on, and their hair is done just so, and they swagger just like this, and you don't have to be verbally told that this is the bad guy. You just know, because that's what the bad guy looks like, right? It's like that. So the second thing we need to know about Zacchaeus is that he was a tax collector. And another way of talking about tax collectors in Jesus' day was to call them tax farmers, which is kind of a weird name for them, but you'll get there. You see, Rome wanted taxes paid. They were the main source of wealth for the empire. And these taxes were what gave the emperor the money they needed to pay the army, which then in turn gave Rome their power. However, the Roman government didn't want to have to do too much work to get the taxes into their coffers. That makes a certain amount of sense. In 2017, the CRA cost Canadian taxpayers $4.1 billion to run. Collecting taxes, honestly, is an expensive process. And in ancient Rome, with an empire that stretched to the English Channel in the north and southern Egypt in the south, this was going to be even more expensive for them. So instead, they had this system whereby private individuals would bid on how much money they thought they could exact in taxes. And now, obviously, Rome would outsource the collection of these taxes to whoever was the highest bidder. These tax farmers who bid on the services paid Rome in advance, and then they would go home and farm the taxes out of the people. That is, Obviously, they would collect as much tax as they had paid for the right to collect it in the first place. Their income was supposed to just come from commissions on tolls and customs, but what actually happened was that they farmed wherever they could, and it ended up with an awful lot more bribery and corruption than might have been officially intended. So Zacchaeus is a tax collector, but he's not just any old tax collector. He's the chief tax collector in the area. He's at the top of the tax collecting heap. He's got people under him collecting the taxes at the city gates, people going into houses to collect taxes for him, people guarding the money for him. He's the bigwig on the top of the pile, the rich, the powerful one among the underbelly of Jericho's Roman collaborators. And how did he get there? How did he have enough wealth to participate in this system, but not only that, but to buy his way literally to the top of it? My guess is he was probably generationally wealthy, that his dad, his granddad, and his great-granddad before him had also been tax collectors. And all of which means he wasn't exactly what you'd call popular in Jericho. Tax rates were pretty high to begin with. Then you add the bribery, then you add the extortion, then you add the fact that for Jews, the taxes were tied to Roman authority. And not only that, but Jews were actually asked to pay those taxes with coins stamped with an impression of the emperor, a fact which they found to be idolatrous. So, all in all, people aren't too happy with Mr. Zacchaeus. But here he is. He's incredibly wealthy, powerful, wildly important, doing a job that allows him to easily perpetuate unjust monetary practices on his fellow Jews in ways that also render him ritually unclean, unable to access many of the religious practices of his people. His wealth and power and lack of popularity have possibly been the only world he's ever known. But he's heard stories about Jesus, maybe for weeks or months, maybe even years at this point in Jesus' ministry. And it feels like he must have had some yearning or desire that had been growing in him. Because Luke tells us that when he heard that Jesus was coming, he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore tree to see him. Zacchaeus, chief tax collector of Jericho, is not just vaguely interested in Jesus. Something he's heard or something he's seen has left him passionately curious about meeting Jesus. And somehow, unwilling to push his weight around to get what he wants in this instance, he throws off his dignity, hitches up his robes, and climbs a tree. Lo and behold, Jesus passes by, just as he had figured. He sees Zacchaeus in the tree, stops at the bottom of it, and looks up. I'm hoping, just as an aside, that Zacchaeus had the forethought to gather his robes maybe around his ankles after he got up there, but there's no guarantee that happened. Either way, Jesus looks up at Zacchaeus, says, "Get down quick, for I must stay at your house today." Luke says that Zacchaeus hurried down and was happy to welcome him. But I feel like after all that rush and fuss and tree climbing, maybe happy was a little bit of an understatement. I think Zacchaeus was thrilled. I think he was honored. How could he not be? He had hoped for a chance to see Jesus, and now Jesus is coming to his house as an honored guest. It's the best thing that could have possibly happened to him. Now, before we keep reading, I think there's a pause in the story that we need to note. A period of time that Luke is silent on. Action that hasn't been recorded. More specifically, I think that there's a party. And when I start to think about what happens in that silence, this is what I remember, and this is what I imagine. First, I remember that a wealthy Jew in Jericho in Jesus' day would have had a large household. A far cry from our small nuclear families. Along with his wife and children, there might well have been an elderly parent or aunts, cousins, siblings, all filling up the space. Along with that, his home would have doubled as a place for meetings. during the day at the best of times. And with such a distinguished guest gracing his table on this day, I wonder how many of his underlings and business associates had invited themselves over for lunch as well. Then there's Jesus. Then there's his disciples. Then there's the women who are continuously Jesus' travel companions. In other words, I remember that far from some small, intimate gathering between Jesus and Zacchaeus, this would have been a party, a celebration, a distinct act of hospitality. I imagine the way the conversation might flow between the various members of the party, how some of those less intrigued by Jesus' presence might split off into different conversational groups around the room for a while and then maybe prick up their ears and move closer to listen to a particularly interesting story. I imagine, though, that whatever else was going on in the house that day that needed managed, whatever people were talking about, it wasn't being done or being listened to by Zacchaeus. Nope. I'm pretty sure that whatever burning desire for change had driven him up that sycamore tree, now he was sitting right next to Jesus, soaking in every story, almost oblivious to the rest of the party. And why do I think that? Because over the course of this long afternoon, over the length of this party that perhaps stretched fully into the evening, something in Zacchaeus starts to fit into place. This man who had likely been born into wealth, this guy who had happily bid on contracts with the Roman government to collect taxes on his fellow Jews, this one who was throwing a party off of the wealth he had made from the excesses of extortion made possible by his role as a tax collector. This guy hears something in the stories being told, in the parables being retold, in the voice and the posture and the approach of Jesus, and whatever it is that had been rumbling deep down inside of him that made him climb that tree hours ago to catch a glimpse of Jesus clicks into position in a way that it has never done so before. In my imagination, the moment comes halfway through the fourth course of this opulent meal. Suddenly, Zacchaeus looks up and down the table, still laden with food. He looks around at the dozen or so servants waiting on their every need, takes in the sumptuous wall coverings and plump floor cushions, and remembers the hovels he's visited, the threadbare clothes of the people he's exacted tolls from. And as Jesus maybe retells the story of the pearl found in a field, or the parable of the lost coin, or the story of the great dinner, all of a sudden Zacchaeus realizes that everything he has come at the cost of someone else, and often created pain for them. And more than that, for all that he's got, Zacchaeus realizes he's missing out on something greater. Now, maybe in response, he sits there and mulls it over quietly to himself. Maybe he slips away silently from the table to sit and think for a bit on his fancy Roman indoor toilet. But any guy who climbs a sycamore tree seems like he's more the type to jump suddenly to his feet in the middle of the dining room, overturning jugs and sending food and plates and crockery flying, and maybe even the odd person or two. Regardless, the next thing you know, he is making some remarkable statements. Here's what it says in Luke. "Look, Lord, I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I have cheated anyone, I repay them 4 times as much." Can you see the guests looking around the room, mentally calculating how much he's talking about here? Half of his slaves, half of his rugs, half of his clothes. How is he going to calculate the value of the beautiful lapis lazuli mosaic he just had installed? Where does this leave those he's been patron to, the tax collectors under him? What are the Romans going to think? What will this mean for Zacchaeus' future? My guess is that there is an awful lot of mental arithmetic going on in the room, and a lot of scrambling among those who feel threatened by this move to make sure that they are safe on the other side of it. Jesus doesn't seem surprised or threatened or upset or worried about any of it. His response? Today, salvation has come to this house because he too is the son of Abraham. For the Son of Man comes to seek and to save the lost. Now, earlier, people outside had grumbled and complained about Jesus' show of favoritism to this clear sinner in their community. Didn't Jesus know what kind of man this was? Didn't Jesus know what kind of wealth he had gained? How dare Jesus eat off the backs of their stolen goods? Yet even as he tells Zacchaeus that he's coming to his house for dinner, Jesus seems to know something about the potential for transformation that is found in hospitality. And now Jesus takes Zacchaeus' statement as a sign of repentance. He hears and acknowledges the shift in posture and approach and behavior and marks this as salvation. This is the point of his coming. This is the point of the meal. This is the point of the party. Because the party is a space where transformation takes place. Now, I don't have to tell those of you who have been at Vox since before COVID about the power of hospitality. This is one of those spiritual disciplines we've put a lot of time and effort and energy and thought into. In non-COVID times, we practice this discipline in big parties and coffee dates, multi-family meals, and games nights. Most of us have stories we can point to of times when we were at a party or a gathering with other people from Vox, and a thing that's been bugging us or rustling around in our heads for a while seems to shift, just like it did for Zacchaeus that day. I remember a day when I was out celebrating somebody's birthday with a group about 6 years ago, and Erin mentioned this book she'd been reading, The Gifts of Imperfection. And I knew immediately that it was the next step on the journey I was on to try to find freedom from the shame I had lived under for decades. I remember looking out over our Christmas parties and spotting a couple of friends talking with Nathan for the first time, and the distinct pleasure I had when I saw them show up for church the next morning to continue the conversation. Jax told me recently about the time when, shortly after he started coming to Vox, he showed up at men's night early and feeling pretty bummed about some things he'd been given as ideas from his previous church. But he started chatting with Rob, and it became a real turning point for him in his own journey. So everything in my mind right now wants to invite you this morning to a party. After saying all of that, I want to remind you to have meals with each other. I want to tell you that this is what Zacchaeus' story reminds me of, that hospitality and shared meals are important spaces for us to put ourselves if we want to learn how to be the people Jesus would be if Jesus were us. But then I come crashing down to earth because COVID. We can't have a party yet. We can't meet up together to eat together, and with it being this cold and snowy, we can't even really grab a coffee and have a socially distanced chat outside at the park. And as I was preparing this sermon, I was feeling rather dejected about all of this, to be honest. I realized my current COVID response is to hibernate, to pull back, to focus on my schoolwork and my assignments and on just getting through, and to honestly repress and ignore the loneliness and pain that all of this has caused, because there's not a lot I can do about it right now. And maybe that's just me, but maybe some of you are feeling a little bit like that as well. So I called up some folks a couple weeks ago and I asked them, do you think it's possible for us to still do hospitality right now? Should I even be preaching this sermon, or is that just like rubbing our faces in something we can't have right now? I shouldn't have been surprised, but I was honestly blown away with the ideas the folks I talked to had come up with and were actively practicing for how to keep doing hospitality with one another as the weeks and months of isolation and social distancing have continued. Here's just a few of their ideas. Host a Zoom dinner. Make dinner or pickles or jam or pie or cookies or brownies for someone and leave them on their doorstep. Play a game with someone together over Zoom. It could be a board game. It could be an online game, doesn't matter. Send some gift cards to people for Skip the Dishes or Uber Eats or one of your favorite local restaurants. Drop off some groceries and a recipe with someone and then cook together over Zoom. We know from Zacchaeus' time with Jesus that hospitality changes things. We know from our experiences at Vox that this discipline is part of what makes us who we are. But I was particularly struck by something Michelle said at the end of that conversation, that COVID is giving her an opportunity to become more intentional about her hospitality. The idea that COVID is an opportunity for good things can be really hard to remember some days. But if it is an opportunity for anything, then I want to take that opportunity. I want whatever good things are available to come out of this for myself and for us as a community. So with that being said, this morning I have 2 challenges. The first one, if you're one of the amazing, incredible folks we have at Vox that are leaning into hospitality over the last few months, one of the incredibly creative, out-of-the-box thinkers that we are so blessed to have in our community, I'm going to challenge you to share those creative ideas either in the chat this morning or over on our Vox family page so that we can all learn from your experiences. And if you've been the recipient of one of these amazing creative ideas and you don't see the person posting about it, don't tell us who it was, but please tell us the idea and tell us what difference it made. And if you're like me and you've pulled back from trying because you're just tired or lonely or worn out or out of spoons, I'm going to challenge you to pick one idea from this list. One idea, one person. And I'm going to challenge you to try it out this week and see how it goes. Then I'm going to challenge you to do it again the next week. Slowly, carefully, but intentionally start to ease your way back in. It looks like we're still in for at least a few more tough months of this. We're all getting tired. Some of us are really losing hope. But we know the powerful transformation possible in all of us when we encounter one another through the discipline of hospitality. We've seen it in Zacchaeus' life this morning, and a lot of us have seen it in our own lives over the years. So I'm going to encourage you to get back to this core Vox discipline. I'm going to encourage you to share your ideas with us. I'm going to encourage you to share stories of the ways in which these moments and experiences of hospitality shifted or encouraged you or reminded you that you were not alone. And I'm going to encourage you to hold out hope for the incredible party we're going to have when all of this is done. Let's pray. God, thank you that you created a world in which a party was a transformative, sanctifying, faith-shifting experience. God, I pray that you would help us to see creative ideas for how we can join in with your transformation story in the days and weeks to come. I pray that you would help us to see how we can do this even in the face of COVID restrictions. And I pray, God, that you would continue to form us and shape us and make us more and more into the people you always intended for us to be. Amen.